The wind cut through the Texas plains like a rusted blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something that made Samuel Morgan's weathered hands tighten on his horse's reins. Smoke, not the clean smoke of a campfire, but the acrid, lingering smell of destruction. Sam pulled his coat collar higher and squinted through the grey afternoon light. His mount, a sturdy bay named Grit, snorted and shook her head, sensing the tension in her rider's body. They'd been riding for 3 days straight, heading toward the trading post at Bent Creek, when the smoke had first appeared on the horizon. "Easy, girl," Sam murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind. It was about the only thing he'd said aloud in the past 2 days. Folks called him Silent Sam for good reason. Words had never come easy to him, not since Martha and little Rebecca had been taken from him 5 years back. As they crested a low rise, the source of the smoke became clear. Below them, scattered across a shallow valley, lay the remains of what had once been a small Comanche winter camp. The hide lodges were collapsed and burned, dark stains marking the snow where the fires had melted through to the frozen earth beneath. Bodies lay scattered like discarded dolls, their colorful clothing stark against the white ground. Sam's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before, too many times. The cavalry had been through here, probably yesterday from the look of it. The 7th Regiment had been pushing hard this winter, trying to force the remaining Comanche bands onto the reservation before spring. This looked like their handiwork. He should have ridden on, should have minded his own business and continued toward Bent Creek. But something made him guide Grit down the slope, his eyes scanning the devastation, with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read death scenes like others read newspapers. The camp had been small, maybe 8 or 10 lodges at most, probably a family group that had broken away from the main band, trying to winter in this sheltered valley. Sam counted 12 bodies, mostly women and elderly men. The warriors would have been out hunting, or maybe they'd died fighting and the cavalry had taken their bodies. As he rode slowly through the camp, checking each lodge for survivors, Sam's chest tightened with familiar grief. The scene brought back memories he'd spent years trying to bury. His own ranch, his own family, his own helplessness in the face of sudden violence. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the wind's mournful whistle, a whimper. Weak, barely human, but unmistakably the cry of something alive. Sam dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the snow as he followed the sound. It led him to a partially collapsed lodge at the edge of the camp, where a section of buffalo hide had been pulled away from the wooden frame. Beneath it, wrapped in a beaded blanket and nearly buried in snow, was a baby. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 months old, her tiny brown face pinched with cold and hunger. Her black hair was matted with ice, and her lips had a blue tinge that made Sam's heart race. She was dying and probably had been for hours. For a moment, Sam just stared. This was a Comanche child, the daughter of the people who had killed his own family. Every rational thought in his head told him to walk away, to let nature take its course. The baby represented everything he'd learned to hate and fear over the past 5 years. But as he looked down at that tiny face, so still and peaceful despite the cold, he saw something else. He saw Rebecca, his own daughter, who'd had the same dark hair and the same way of curling her little fists when she slept. He saw innocence. He saw a life that hung by a thread, waiting for someone to choose mercy over vengeance. "Damn," Sam whispered, the word barely audible in the wind. He knelt and carefully lifted the baby from the snow, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She stirred slightly at his touch, letting out another weak cry that cut through him like a knife. Without thinking, he opened his coat and pulled her inside, against his chest, sharing his warmth. The baby's skin was so cold it burned against his hands, but he could feel her heartbeat, faint but steady. She was alive, and that was something. Sam stood slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't take her to Bent Creek. The trading post was full of settlers who'd shoot a Comanche baby on sight. He couldn't leave her here to die. And he sure as hell couldn't take her back to his own place, where his neighbors would ask questions he couldn't answer. That left only one option, and it was the most dangerous one of all. He'd have to take her north, through 200 miles of hostile territory, to find the main Comanche band. He'd have to return her to her people, and somehow survive the journey through land crawling with cavalry patrols and settlers who'd consider him a traitor for what he was about to do. As he walked back toward Grit, the baby tucked securely inside his coat, Sam caught sight of something glinting in the snow near the collapsed lodge. He bent down and picked up a small silver pendant, shaped like a star, that had probably fallen from the baby's clothing. Looking closer, he noticed she had a birthmark on her forehead, a small star-shaped mark that seemed to echo the pendant's design. "Little star," he said quietly, surprising himself by speaking aloud. "Guess that's what I'll call you." He carefully placed the pendant in his coat pocket, then began the delicate process of preparing for a journey that would test every skill he'd learned in 30 years on the frontier. First, he'd need to modify his saddlebags to create a safe, warm space for the baby. Then he'd need to plan a route that avoided the main trails and cavalry posts. As he worked, the baby stirred against his chest, and for just a moment, her tiny hand gripped his finger through the fabric of his shirt. The gesture was so small, so trusting, that it nearly broke his heart. "Don't you worry, little star," Sam whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm gonna get you home. I promise." The wind picked up again, howling across the devastated camp like the voices of the dead, but Sam barely heard it. He was already planning their route north, already calculating distances and dangers, already committed to a course of action that would either redeem him or destroy him. One way or another, he was going to make sure this baby lived. By the time Sam had finished modifying his saddlebags, the afternoon sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of gold and crimson. He'd used his spare blanket and some rope to create a makeshift cradle inside the left saddlebag, lined with his extra shirt to provide cushioning. It wasn't much, but it would keep Little Star warm and hidden from prying eyes. The baby had grown quiet against his chest, her breathing more regular now that she'd warmed up. Sam had managed to get her to take a few drops of water from his canteen, mixed with a tiny bit of sugar from his supplies. It wasn't milk, but it was something. "Time to go, Little Star," he murmured, carefully lifting her from inside his coat. She stirred and whimpered softly, her dark eyes opening to look at him with that unfocused gaze of the very young. For a moment, Sam felt the full weight of what he'd taken on. This tiny life was now completely dependent on him, and he was about to carry her through some of the most dangerous territory in Texas. He gently placed her in the modified saddlebag, making sure she was secure but could still breathe easily. The opening was positioned so he could check on her while riding, and he'd fashioned a flap that would protect her from wind and snow while keeping her hidden from view. As he swung up into the saddle, Sam took one last look at the devastated camp. The dead deserved burial, but he couldn't spare the time. Every hour he delayed increased the chances that a cavalry patrol would find them. He touched his hat brim in a gesture of respect, then urged Grit northward. The first challenge came sooner than expected. They'd been riding for less than an hour when Sam spotted dust rising in the distance, riders coming from the east, moving fast. His heart hammered as he quickly guided Grit behind a cluster of mesquite trees and dismounted. "Shh, Little Star," he whispered, checking the saddlebag. The baby was sleeping peacefully, apparently lulled by the motion of the horse. Sam peered through the bare branches and counted 6 riders wearing the blue uniforms of the 7th Cavalry. They were heading directly toward the camp he'd just left, probably coming back to finish the job. Sam muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. He'd seen it before, cavalry units that returned to destroyed camps to make sure there were no survivors, no witnesses to their methods. The patrol rode past without noticing him, their horses' hooves drumming against the frozen ground. Sam waited until they were well out of sight, before mounting again and continuing north. The encounter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. If they'd been discovered, Little Star would have been killed on the spot and Sam would have been arrested as a traitor, or worse. As darkness fell, Sam found shelter in a grove of cottonwoods near a frozen creek. He couldn't risk a fire, so he wrapped Little Star in his coat and held her close while sharing his cold supper of jerky and hardtack. The baby had woken up fussing, and Sam was beginning to understand the magnitude of his problem. She needed milk, and he had no way to provide it. "What am I doing?" he asked himself quietly, looking down at the infant's face in the starlight. "I don't know the first thing about babies." But even as doubt crept in, Sam remembered the feel of Little Star's tiny hand gripping his finger. She was counting on him, and he'd made a promise. He'd kept precious few promises in his life, but this one he intended to honor. The next morning brought new challenges. Sam had barely slept, waking every time the baby stirred to make sure she was still breathing. She was growing weaker. He could see it in the way she moved, in the faintness of her cries. They needed to find help, but where could he turn? The answer came to him as they rode through a valley he recognized. About 10 miles east was the small ranch of Miguel Herrera, a Mexican vaquero who'd always been friendly to Sam. More importantly, Miguel had a wife and young children. If anyone could help with the baby, it would be Maria Herrera. But approaching the ranch meant taking a significant risk. The Herreras were good people, but they were also practical. Harboring a Comanche baby could bring down the wrath of the cavalry on their entire family. Sam spent the morning wrestling with the decision as they rode through increasingly familiar territory. Little Star grew more restless as the day wore on, her cries becoming weaker but more frequent. Finally, when she hadn't taken any water for several hours, Sam made his choice. The Herrera ranch sat in a protected valley, surrounded by low hills that provided natural windbreaks. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Sam could see Miguel's distinctive paint horses grazing in the nearby pasture. As he approached the adobe house, his heart pounded with nervous energy. Miguel emerged from the barn, a smile spreading across his weathered face when he recognized Sam. "Hola, mi amigo, what brings you out in this cold?" Sam dismounted slowly, his hand hovering near the saddlebag. "Miguel, I need your help, and I need you to trust me." The Mexican's expression grew serious. "Of course, Samuel. What is it?" Sam carefully opened the saddlebag and lifted Little Star out. The baby was so still that for a moment he feared the worst, but then she stirred weakly in his arms. Miguel's eyes widened. "Dios mío, a baby! Samuel, what—" "Found her at a destroyed camp," Sam said quickly. "She's dying, Miguel. I need Maria's help." Miguel stared at the infant, taking in her distinctive features, the beadwork on her blanket. "She is Comanche." "Yes. And you are taking her where?" "Back to her people, north." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Maria," he called toward the house. "Ven aquí, por favor." Maria Herrera appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw the baby in Sam's arms, her maternal instincts took over immediately. "Pobrecita, give her to me." What followed was the most hopeful hour Sam had experienced since finding Little Star. Maria took the baby inside, warmed her by the fire, and managed to get her to drink some goat's milk mixed with water. The improvement was almost immediate. Little Star's color returned, and she began to move more actively. "She is very weak," Maria said, cradling the infant. "But she will live, if she is cared for properly." "I don't know how to care for her," Sam admitted, feeling helpless. Maria looked at him with knowing eyes. "You have kept her alive for 2 days, Samuel. You know more than you think." She showed him how to prepare the goat's milk, how to hold the baby for feeding, how to keep her warm and dry. Miguel contributed a small clay bottle that could serve as a makeshift feeding vessel, and Maria insisted on packing extra blankets and a supply of dried goat's milk. As Sam prepared to leave, Miguel pulled him aside. "Be careful, amigo. There are cavalry patrols everywhere, and if they find you with her—" "I know the risks," Sam replied, "but I gave her my word." Miguel nodded with understanding. "Then may God go with you both." As Sam rode away from the ranch, with Little Star secure in her modified saddlebag and a supply of milk for the journey, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The baby was stronger now, and he had the tools to keep her alive, but the most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. Tomorrow they would have to cross the main trail between Fort Griffin and the northern settlements, a route heavily patrolled by cavalry and used by settlers who would shoot a Comanche baby on sight. As the sun set behind them, Sam checked on Little Star one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, her tiny face relaxed and healthy-looking. "We're gonna make it, Little Star," he whispered. "I promise we're gonna make it." The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't sound like the voices of the dead. This time it sounded like the whisper of possibility. The main trail stretched before them like a scar across the landscape, rutted from countless wagon wheels and pounded flat by cavalry horses. Sam crouched behind a limestone outcropping, studying the route he'd have to cross. It was mid-morning, and the sun cast long shadows that would help conceal them, but the open ground on either side of the trail offered little cover. Little Star stirred in her saddlebag, making a soft cooing sound that had become familiar to Sam over the past 3 days. She was stronger now, taking the goat's milk regularly and sleeping more peacefully. The star-shaped birthmark on her forehead seemed more pronounced as her color improved, and Sam had caught himself more than once, simply watching her sleep, marveling at how completely she trusted him. "Just a little longer, Little Star," he whispered, adjusting the blanket around her. "Then we'll be across and heading into safer country." But as he prepared to make his move, the sound of approaching horses froze him in place. Her column of cavalry emerged from the morning haze, at least 20 men riding in formation, their blue uniforms stark against the pale landscape. Sam's blood ran cold when he recognized the officer leading them, Captain William Garrett, a man known throughout the territory for his brutal efficiency in dealing with the Indian problem. Sam pressed himself lower behind the rocks, his hand instinctively moving to cover the saddlebag opening. Garrett's column was heading south, probably toward the destroyed camp Sam had found 3 days ago. If they discovered his tracks leading away from the massacre site, the cavalry passed within 50 yards of his hiding spot, their horses' breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Sam held his breath, praying that Little Star would remain quiet. As if sensing the danger, the baby stayed perfectly still, her dark eyes wide but silent. It took nearly 10 minutes for the entire column to pass. Sam waited another 10 before emerging from cover, his muscles cramped from staying motionless for so long. The trail was clear now, but for how long? He mounted quickly and urged Grit into a fast trot across the open ground. They made it to the other side without incident, but Sam's nerves were frayed. The encounter with Garrett's column had reminded him just how many people were looking for any excuse to kill a Comanche child. By afternoon, they'd reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, a small settlement that had grown up around a trading post and grain mill. Sam had hoped to skirt the town entirely, but Little Star needed feeding, and his supply of goat's milk was running low. The settlement might have what he needed, if he could find someone willing to trade without asking too many questions. Sam approached Cedar Falls from the east, keeping to the tree line along the creek. The town was larger than he'd expected, with maybe 30 buildings scattered along the main street. Most were the typical frontier structures, false-fronted stores, a saloon, a church with a modest steeple. But what caught his attention was the smoke rising from several chimneys and the number of horses tied up along the street. The town was busy, which meant more people to notice a lone rider with suspicious cargo. He found what he was looking for at the edge of town, a small homestead with a few goats grazing in a pen behind a modest cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, and laundry hung on a line despite the cold weather. Someone was home, and they kept goats. Sam dismounted and approached the cabin carefully, Little Star's saddlebag positioned on the side away from the building. A woman emerged before he could knock, middle-aged with graying hair and suspicious eyes that took in his trail-worn appearance. "Help you with something, mister?" "Name's Sam Morgan, ma'am. I'm traveling north and wondering if you might have some goat's milk to spare. I can pay." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Milk? That's an odd request. Most folks want coffee or whiskey." Sam had prepared for this question. "Got a sick horse. Sometimes milk helps settle their stomach." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose I can spare a bottle. Cost you 50 cents. "That's fair." As the woman went to fetch the milk, Sam heard voices approaching from the direction of town. 3 men were walking toward the cabin, their conversation carrying clearly in the cold air. "Seen him ride in from the east," one was saying. "Looked like he was trying to avoid the main street." "Could be anybody," another replied. "But with all these Indian troubles, can't be too careful. Sheriff wants to talk to any strangers passing through. Orders from the army." Sam's heart began to race. The woman emerged from the cabin with a bottle of milk, just as the 3 men reached the yard. One of them, a tall man with a deputy's badge, looked Sam up and down with obvious suspicion. "Afternoon," the deputy said. "Don't believe we've met. Name's Deputy Reynolds." "Sam Morgan," Sam replied, keeping his voice steady. "Just passing through. Where you headed?" "North. Looking for work on the cattle ranches." Reynolds nodded, but his eyes kept drifting to Sam's horse and saddlebags. "Unusual time of year to be looking for ranch work. Most spreads are laying off hands for the winter. That's why I'm heading north. Heard there might be opportunities around Fort Worth." The deputy took a step closer. "Mind if I ask what you're carrying in those saddlebags? They look mighty full." Sam's mouth went dry. Little Star chose that moment to make a soft sound, barely audible but enough to make Reynolds' eyes narrow. "Just my gear," Sam said quickly. "Bedroll, supplies, that sort of thing." Sounded like something moved in there. "Got a cat," Sam said, the lie coming automatically. "Found her as a kitten and she's been traveling with me ever since. Good for keeping mice out of my supplies." Reynolds looked skeptical, but before he could respond, Little Star made another sound, a soft mewing that could have been a kitten if you weren't listening carefully. "Hear that?" Sam said, forcing a smile. "She gets restless when we stop too long." The deputy's suspicion seemed to ease slightly. "Well, I suppose that explains it. Still, I'll need to see some identification. Army's orders." Sam's mind raced. He had no identification, and if Reynolds insisted on searching his saddlebags— "I don't carry papers," he said. "Most cowboys don't." "That may be, but—" "Tom Reynolds, leave that man alone," the woman interrupted, stepping between them. He's paying good money for milk and minding his own business. That's more than I can say for some folks in this town. Reynolds flushed but backed down. Just doing my job, Mrs. Patterson. Well, do it somewhere else. This is my property. The deputy and his companions left, but not before Reynolds gave Sam one last hard look. Don't stay in town too long, Morgan. We like to keep track of strangers. After they were gone, Mrs. Patterson handed Sam the milk bottle. Tom Reynolds is a good man, but he's been jumpy ever since the Indian troubles started. Lost his brother in a raid last year. I'm sorry to hear that, Sam said, meaning it. Thank you for the milk and for, well, thank you. She waved away his gratitude. A man's got a right to travel without being harassed. Besides, I like cats. As Sam rode away from Cedar Falls, he realized how close he'd come to disaster. If Mrs. Patterson hadn't intervened, if Little Star had made a more distinctive sound, if Reynolds had been more persistent, he shuddered to think what would have happened. The encounter had shaken him, but it had also revealed something important. Not everyone in this territory was consumed by hatred. There were still decent people like Mrs. Patterson and the Herreras, people who would help a stranger without asking too many questions. As the sun began to set, Sam found shelter in a grove of oak trees near a small stream. He carefully lifted Little Star from her saddlebag and fed her the fresh goat's milk. She took it eagerly, her tiny hands gripping his finger as she drank. That was too close, Little Star, he murmured, holding her against his chest. But we made it through. We're learning how to do this, you and me. The baby looked up at him with those dark, trusting eyes, and Sam felt his heart constrict with an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just responsibility anymore, or even compassion. It was something deeper, something that scared him with its intensity. As he settled in for the night, with Little Star sleeping peacefully in his arms, Sam stared up at the stars and wondered what he was becoming. The man who had found this baby 3 days ago would never have risked his life for a Comanche child, but that man was gone, replaced by someone who would do anything to protect the tiny life in his care. The change frightened him, but it also filled him with a purpose he hadn't felt since losing his own family. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers they still had to face, Sam knew one thing for certain. He would see Little Star safely home, or die trying. The wind whispered through the oak leaves above them, and for the first time in days it sounded like a lullaby. The first snowflakes began falling just after dawn, fat and lazy, drifting down from a sky the color of old pewter. Sam had been watching the weather for 2 days, reading the signs in the way the wind shifted and the horses grew restless. A storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones, like an old wound. They were 5 days out from Cedar Falls now, traveling through the broken country north of the Red River. The landscape had changed from rolling plains to rough hills and deep arroyos, terrain that offered more shelter, but also more places for trouble to hide. Sam had been pushing hard, covering as much ground as possible while the weather held. Little Star had grown stronger with each passing day. She was taking more milk, sleeping better, and had even begun to smile, a tiny, fleeting expression that never failed to catch Sam off guard. This morning, she'd reached for his face with her small hands, her fingers brushing against his beard with obvious fascination. "You're getting to be quite the little traveler," Sam murmured as he adjusted her blankets in the saddlebag. "But I'm afraid we're in for some rough weather." As if in response to his words, the wind picked up, driving the snow more horizontally. Within an hour, the lazy flakes had become a steady fall, and by midday it was clear they were facing a serious storm. Sam had been through blizzards before, but never with a baby depending on him. He needed to find shelter soon before the storm reached its full fury. The problem was, they were in the middle of nowhere, with no towns or settlements within 20 miles. The snow was falling so heavily now that Sam could barely see 50 yards ahead. Grit was struggling through drifts that were already knee-deep, and the temperature was dropping fast. Sam's mustache was crusted with ice, and his fingers were growing numb despite his heavy gloves. "Come on, girl," he urged the horse, "and there's got to be something up ahead." That's when he saw it, a dark shape barely visible through the swirling snow. As they got closer, Sam realized it was an old line shack, probably built by some long-gone rancher for his winter riders. The roof was partially collapsed, and the door hung askew on its hinges, but it was shelter. Sam dismounted and pushed through the snow to examine the structure. The back wall was solid, and most of the roof was intact. With some work, he could make it livable for the duration of the storm. More importantly, it would protect Little Star from the killing cold. He led Grit inside, grateful that the shack was large enough to accommodate both horse and riders. The floor was covered with old hay and debris, but it was dry. Sam quickly unsaddled the horse and retrieved his supplies, including the precious bottle of goat's milk. Little Star was awake and fussing, clearly uncomfortable with the cold and the strange surroundings. Sam lifted her from the saddlebag and held her close, feeling how cold she'd gotten despite the blankets. "I know, Little Star," he whispered. "I know it's cold, but we're going to get through this." The next few hours were the most challenging of Sam's life. The storm raged outside with a fury that shook the old shack's walls, and the temperature inside dropped steadily. Sam had managed to build a small fire using dry wood from the debris, but it provided only a small circle of warmth. Little Star was struggling with the cold. Her lips had taken on a blue tinge, and her breathing was becoming shallow. Sam knew he had to do something drastic, or she wouldn't survive the night. He made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. He opened his coat and shirt and placed Little Star directly against his skin, wrapping them both in every blanket he had. The baby's cold little body pressed against his chest, and Sam used his own body heat to keep her warm. "Stay with me, Little Star," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't you give up on me now." As the storm raged outside, Sam found himself talking to the baby in a way he'd never talked to anyone. The words came slowly at first, then in a steady stream as the long night wore on. "I had a little girl once," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Her name was Rebecca. She had dark hair like yours, and she used to grab my finger just like you do. She'd be about 7 now if she'd lived." Little Star stirred against his chest, her tiny hand finding his finger and gripping it with surprising strength. "I wasn't there when they came," Sam continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I was out checking cattle, and when I got back, Martha and Rebecca were gone. I've been angry about it for 5 years. Angry at the world, angry at God, angry at myself." The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sam fed it another piece of wood and settled back against the wall, still holding Little Star close. "But you know what, Little Star? I'm not angry anymore. Not at you anyway. You're just a baby. You didn't hurt anybody. You didn't choose to be Comanche any more than Rebecca chose to be white." The baby made a soft sound, and Sam looked down to see her dark eyes looking up at him with that trusting gaze that had become so familiar. "I used to think all Indians were the same," he admitted, "that they were all killers and raiders. But that's not true, is it? The ones who killed my family, they were just men. Angry men, maybe desperate men, but just men. And there are good people and bad people in every race." As the night wore on, Sam found himself confronting truths he'd been avoiding for years. He thought about Maria Herrera, who had helped Little Star without hesitation. He thought about the Comanche woman who had died, trying to protect this baby. He thought about his own daughter, and wondered if some Indian man had found her and chosen mercy over vengeance. "I'm taking you home, Little Star," he said quietly. "But I'm not doing it because I feel guilty about what happened to your family. I'm doing it because you're worth saving, because you're innocent and beautiful and you deserve to live." The storm began to ease sometime before dawn, the howling wind settling to a steady whisper. Sam had dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to check on Little Star. Each time he was relieved to feel her warm breath against his chest, to see her peaceful face in the firelight. As the first grey light of morning filtered through the cracks in the walls, Sam realized something had changed inside him. The anger that had driven him for 5 years was gone, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten. Hope, not just for Little Star, but for himself. He looked down at the baby sleeping against his chest and smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. "We made it through the storm, Little Star," he whispered. "And you know what? I think we're both going to be okay." Outside, the wind had died to a gentle breeze, and Sam could hear the sound of snow sliding off the roof. The worst was over. They had survived the blizzard, and in doing so Sam had found something he'd thought was lost forever: the ability to love without reservation, to protect without hatred, to hope without fear. As he prepared to venture outside and assess the damage, Sam felt a lightness in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. The journey was far from over, but they had passed through the crucible of the storm and emerged stronger. Little Star stirred in his arms, her tiny hand reaching up to touch his face. Sam caught her finger gently and smiled. "Almost home, Little Star," he said softly. "Almost home." The Comanche camp appeared through the morning mist like something from a dream. Dozens of lodges stretched along the banks of a creek, their buffalo hide walls painted with symbols Sam didn't understand, but somehow found beautiful. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could see people moving about their daily routines. Women tending children, men caring for horses, elders sitting in circles sharing stories. Sam reined in grit at the top of a low rise, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. After 8 days of travel, they had finally reached their destination. But now that the moment had arrived, he found himself paralyzed with uncertainty. Little Star was awake in her saddlebag, making the soft cooing sounds that had become music to Sam's ears. She was thriving now, her cheeks round and healthy, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. The star-shaped birthmark on her forehead seemed to catch the morning light, giving her an almost ethereal quality. "Well, Little Star," Sam murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "This is it. This is home." As if she understood, the baby reached up toward his face, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Sam caught her hand gently, marveling once again at how completely she trusted him. The sound of approaching horses made Sam look up sharply. 4 Comanche warriors were riding toward him, their faces painted for war, weapons ready. Sam's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but he forced himself to remain still. Any sudden movement would be seen as aggression, and he couldn't risk Little Star's safety. The warriors surrounded him, their horses dancing nervously in the snow. The leader, a man with graying hair and scars across his cheek, spoke in rapid Comanche. Sam couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly hostile. "I don't speak your language," Sam said quietly, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "But I have something that belongs to you." He slowly reached toward the saddlebag, stopping when the warriors raised their weapons. "A baby," he said, his voice carrying across the still morning air. "A Comanche baby." The leader's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he gestured for Sam to continue. With careful movements, Sam lifted Little Star from her saddlebag and held her up so the warriors could see her. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The leader's expression changed from hostility to shock, and he spoke rapidly to his companions. One of the younger warriors let out a cry of recognition and urged his horse forward. "Ayana," the young warrior said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ayana." Sam realized this must be Little Star's Comanche name. He looked down at the baby in his arms, seeing her as her people saw her, not as the enemy's child, but as their own precious daughter, sister, niece. The young warrior dismounted and approached slowly, tears streaming down his face. He spoke in broken English, his voice thick with emotion. My sister's child. We think she is dead." Sam felt his throat tighten. "Your sister?" The warrior nodded. "Cavalry come. Kill everyone. We find bodies but not find Ayana. We look everywhere." "I found her in the ruins," Sam said gently. "She was dying from the cold. I couldn't leave her there." The leader dismounted and approached, studying Sam with keen eyes. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise. "You are the one called Silent Sam. We know of you. Your family was killed by Apache raiders 5 winters past." Sam nodded, surprised by the man's knowledge. "I am Chief Iron Bear," the leader continued. "This child is my granddaughter. Her mother was my daughter, Summer Rain." The weight of that revelation hit Sam like a physical blow. He was holding the granddaughter of a Comanche chief, a child who would have been raised as royalty among her people. "Why?" Iron Bear asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Why did you save her? Why risk your life to bring her home?" Sam looked down at Little Star, at Ayana, sleeping peacefully in his arms. How could he explain what had happened to him over the past 8 days? How could he put into words the transformation that had taken place in his heart? "Because she's innocent," he said finally. "Because she deserved a chance to live. Because—" his voice broke slightly. "Because I couldn't save my own daughter, but I could save her." Iron Bear studied Sam for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have given us the greatest gift possible. You have returned our future to us." The young warrior, who Sam now realized must be Little Star's uncle, approached with trembling hands. "May I?" Sam hesitated for just a moment. For 8 days, this baby had been his responsibility, his purpose, his redemption. Giving her up felt like tearing away a part of his soul, but he knew it was right. This was her family, her people, her home. He gently placed Ayana in her uncle's arms, watching as the man held her with infinite tenderness. The baby looked up at this new face with curiosity but no fear, as if recognizing something familiar in his features. "She'll remember you," Iron Bear said quietly, watching Sam's face. "Children remember love, even when they cannot speak of it." Sam reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out the silver star pendant he'd found in the snow 8 days ago. This was with her when I found her. Iron Bear took the pendant with reverent hands. It belonged to her mother. Summer Rain wore it always. He looked up at Sam with something approaching awe. You have honored our dead and saved our living. This is a debt that cannot be repaid. I don't want repayment, Sam said. I just wanted her to be safe. Iron Bear nodded, then spoke rapidly to the other warriors. They mounted their horses, but before they could leave, the chief turned back to Sam. You will always be welcome in our camp, Silent Sam. You will always have a place at our fires. The woman who bears your children will bear them under our protection, and your sons will be brothers to our sons. Sam felt tears he hadn't shed in years beginning to blur his vision. Thank you. As the warriors prepared to ride back to the camp, Ayana began to fuss. Her uncle tried to comfort her, but she continued to cry, reaching toward Sam with obvious distress. She knows you, Iron Bear observed. You have been her father for 8 days. That bond is not easily broken. Sam approached the horse and gently touched Ayana's cheek. She immediately calmed, her tiny hand gripping his finger with familiar strength. Be strong, little star, he whispered. Be brave and beautiful and free. Remember that someone loved you enough to carry you home. As he pulled his hand away, Ayana made a soft sound that Sam had learned meant contentment. She was going to be all right. She was where she belonged. Sam mounted Grit and turned south, not trusting himself to look back. But Iron Bear's voice stopped him. Silent Sam. He turned in his saddle to see the chief riding toward him, something in his hand. For you, Iron Bear said, holding out a small leather pouch. Medicine to heal old wounds, made by our women for warriors who have seen too much death. Sam accepted the pouch, feeling its weight in his palm. What is it? Hope, Iron Bear said simply. The medicine that allows a man to love again without fear. As Sam rode away from the Comanche camp, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Peace. The anger that had consumed him was gone, replaced by a quiet strength he barely recognized. Little star Ayana was safe with her people, and he had played a part in that miracle. The sun was rising higher now, warming the snow-covered landscape and making the world sparkle like something magical. Sam had nowhere particular to go, no urgent destination calling him. For the first time in years, he was free to choose his own path. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the camp awakening, children laughing, women singing, men calling to their horses. Somewhere in that beautiful chaos, Ayana was beginning her new life, surrounded by love and acceptance. Sam touched the medicine pouch Iron Bear had given him, then urged Grit into a gentle lope. The world was wide and full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, Sam Morgan was ready to meet them. As he rode toward the horizon, the wind carried with it the faint sound of a baby's laughter, and Sam smiled. Little Star was home at last, and so in a way was he. The silent cowboy who had found a dying baby in the snow was gone forever, replaced by a man who understood that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in hatred, but in love. And sometimes the longest journey is not measured in miles, but in the distance between a broken heart and a healed one.